Our God is on his throne ruling the affairs of men. God does not change. His truths have not changed. He's promised a witness in the church according to the election of grace in all ages that will stand for the old paths, defending his truth. The Primitive Baptist Digital Library is pleased to present the Word of Sovereign Grace. Timely video messages based on the King James Bible and the doctrines taught by Christ and the apostles.
Troutner has brought to us this morning his text and the manner in which he has presented it this morning are much in line with the things that are upon my mind. I want to, before we get into the subject matter, just express to you how much I have enjoyed being here with you and how much I appreciate your kindness and hospitality and cherish the love and fellowship that you have shown me since I've been here. It's wonderful to travel among the Lord's people and find that spirit of charity every place you go. And I thank God for that spirit in you. In the 8th chapter of the Roman letter, the Apostle Paul asks a question and then provides an answer. He says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord." The Apostle Paul, in naming all of these perils that may come into a person's life, said that none of them are able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. Not only so, he says, in the circumstance of these things, we're more than conquerors. He says there is an added measure of blessing that we receive when faced with the tribulations and trials of this life. There is a blessing through the love of God that is shed abroad in our heart, and the manifestation of that love in our reaction to the circumstances of our life, to the challenges that we face daily in our lives. He said it produces in us not only a victory over that thing, but produces something more than just a victory over that circumstance or trial or tribulation that we have in our life. This morning, for a few moments, I'd like for us to consider an example of this that is taught in Scripture. It's found in the book of Genesis, and it's a story, and so we're not going to read any specific Scripture from that story, but it's the story of the life of Joseph, who was the son of Jacob, who was one of 12 brothers. He was next to the youngest of his 11 of the 12 brothers, and had a position of special favor so far as his father was concerned. And because of that, he received things from his father and received attention from his father that kindled a jealousy in his brothers. Not only so, excuse me. Not only were they jealous because of his father's favor. But you see, Joseph wasn't any different from most of us. Something that Joseph particularly enjoyed doing was he would observe his brothers doing something that he knew his father would disapprove of. Then he'd run and tell his father about it. Joseph was a tattletale. And no one likes a tattletale. It's easy to despise someone who's a tattletale, isn't it? We've all been tattled on in our life, and no matter how red-handed we were caught as the result of someone telling on us, we always felt to be unjustly condemned because they tattled. And Joseph was a tattletale. His brothers hated him because of that. So one day, Joseph was tending his father's flock. His brethren were over in another area tending the herds over there. And Jacob called Joseph and said, go to your brethren and see how they be. And he gave him some provisions to take over to him. You know, Joseph had some dreams in his life. You know, I can remember when I was a young man, we were talking the other night over at Brother Danny's, and before I was 20 years old, I had decided to be a lawyer. I had decided to be a writer. I had thoughts of maybe being a jet airplane pilot, or just all sorts. I had a lot of dreams in my life. You know, none of those things came to pass. You know, when we're 16, 17, 18 years old, we have a lot of ideas about how our life is going to be as it unfolds. But you know, it almost never unfolds the way we think it's going to. And so Joseph was a dreamer, and he dreamt that in some way he was going to be in a position to have the preeminence over his brothers. Even though he was the next to the youngest, they were going to bow down to him. He was going to be their ruler, if you will. And they hated him for it. He wasn't smart enough to keep his mouth shut about that dream. They hated him the more for that. So he went over to his brethren, and as he was coming over there, one of his brothers saw him coming over to where they were, and they said, lo, the dreamer cometh. You see, they had contempt for him. The dreamer cometh. And so they began to talk to themselves about it, and they said, why don't we just put an end to this little problem that we have in our life? He tattles on us. He's going to come over here, observe what we're doing, and then he's going to go back home and tell Dad what we're doing over here, and he's going to present it in the worst possible light, and Dad's going to be mad at us, and we're going to get chewed out. So why don't we just put it into it? Let's just take his life, and we'll just tell Father Jacob that a beast slew him. So they decided that they would put their brother to death. One of the brothers intervened, Reuben I believe it was, intervened and said, no, let's not do that. Let's just put him in a pit. And we'll leave him there until we're ready to send him home, and then we'll send him home. Well, then Reuben went out to tend the flocks, and there was a caravan of Ishmaelites came through, and they said, why should we shed his blood? There's no profit in that. We'll sell him into slavery. And so Joseph was taken from the pit, was sold as a slave to the Ishmaelites, who carried him down to Egypt, sold him into bondage to Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Now I want you to think about this for just a moment. Look at the twists that in just a matter of a few days or a few hours, the twist that Joseph's life took. He went from being the favored and cherished son of his father Jacob to being a slave down in Egypt. Just like that. Have you ever had a similar experience in your life? Something has happened and it just changed the course of your life completely. You had all these plans of how things were going to go. Something happened. All of a sudden, none of it was going to be the way that you had planned. All of the accomplishments that you had dreamed of in your life, all of them meant nothing now because it was never going to happen. Maybe it was a broken relationship. Maybe it was an affliction in your health. Maybe it was some goal that you were striving for and you failed to accomplish that goal, and because of that you were unable to go on to other goals that you had in your life. Maybe you didn't get into the college that you wanted to go to. Maybe there was a class in college that you just had to have in order to go on with your education, and you failed that class. All of a sudden your life is different. All of the definition that you had placed upon your life and all the plans that you had made in your life, suddenly they were all turned upside down. That's the way it was with Joseph. He was a slave in Egypt. 17 years old. He was 17 years old. You know, I had an experience when I was 19 years old. I went into the U.S. military, into the Army. And my very first day in the Army, I learned two very profound things that I had never known before. One was that not everybody loved me. You see, I thought they did. I thought the world just pretty much orbited around my existence, you know, that everyone was there to serve me. You see, in youth, that's the conceit of youth. That's the arrogance, if you will, of youth, is that we think that our parents are there for us. We think that the school is there for us. We think that that man that we work for is there to give us money. You see, we think that the whole creation just kind of rotates around. That's the arrogance of youth. And if you're young and you feel that way, don't feel bad about it. The Lord is going to wake you up one of these days. He'll show you that that's not really the way things are. And so when I was 19 years old, that's what he did to me. He showed me that there were actually people in the world who didn't love me. That was a very profound awakening. And he showed me something else. He showed me that there were things that I was going to have to do in this life that no matter how distasteful they were, no matter how much I disliked them, no matter how much I would rather be doing something else, I was going to have to do those things. There was just no way out. Because if I didn't do them, the calamity that would come upon me by these people who didn't love me, and therefore I couldn't count on their mercy, was so great as to force me to do things that I didn't want to do. So I got up earlier in the morning than I ever had in my life. I walked further than I had ever walked in my life. I did a lot of things that I didn't like those first few months that I was in the Army. It was a very profound experience. Joseph had a very profound experience at 17 years of age. He was a slave in Egypt. We look at that, and from our standpoint, we might look at that and imagine Joseph's reaction to that. How would you react if at a very tender age you had been plucked from a loving father and sold into slavery? You know, there were countless numbers of people that happened to right in this country. But for a moment, try to place yourself in that condition. You have a very warm and loving relationship with your father, who is your protector, and you feel that things are just going to be wonderful. You're going to have the best of life because you are the favored son or the favored child of your mother and father, and things are just going to be wonderful. And all of a sudden, all that's taken away from you just like that. What would your reaction be? I can tell you what my reaction would be. It's not fair. Why is this happening to me? I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just not going to do it. I'll show them I won't do what they insist that I do. It's a normal reaction, isn't it? It's the way most of us react when we're suddenly the circumstance of our life is changed to our dislike. That's how we react to it, isn't it? But I want you to notice that that was not Joseph's reaction. Joseph was sold into slavery and became a house slave in Potiphar's house, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And it tells us that the Egyptian saw that he, the Egyptian, was being blessed, that his household was being blessed for Joseph's sake, that the Lord was blessing Potiphar for Joseph's sake. And so Potiphar put all of his possessions under the hand of Joseph. You see, Joseph looked at that situation and he said, well, I thought I was always going to be the favored son of Jacob over here. I thought one of these days I'd grow up and the Lord would give me, or my father would give me my own little flock to care for, and I'd marry someone over here and we'd raise children, and my children would be Jacob's favorite grandchildren, and we just have a wonderful life. But it didn't work that way. Now, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to sit here in Egypt? Am I going to sit down and cross my arms and just start pouting? Am I going to have a bitter heart toward God because things have turned the way they have? He said, no. If the circumstance of my life at this present time is for me to be a slave, then I'm going to be the best slave in Egypt. You see, there's a very important lesson, particularly for young people in this. I've never met a young person yet when you ask them, well, what do you want to do when you finish with your school? What kind of vocation are you interested in? I've never heard one yet say, well, I'd like to wash cars for a living. Or, I really admire the work that the janitor does here in the high school. I want to be a janitor when I finish my schooling. We all want to be jet pilots. We want to be basketball stars. We want to be doctors and lawyers and all of those wonderful things. We all aspire to greatness, don't we? But you know what? Someone's got to wash the cars. Someone has to sweep the floors. You see, it's not so important as to what your vocation is, as to how you conduct yourself in your vocation. You see, that's where God receives the glory. God can receive just as much glory from a man sweeping a floor as he can from a heart surgeon transplanting a heart. Just as much glory. And Joseph, God had given a special measure of grace to understand that though he was just a slave down in Egypt, that he could serve his Lord as a slave in Egypt. And look at the witness that Joseph provided. What was it that Potiphar said? He said the Lord was blessing his house for Joseph's sake. You see that there was a witness, there was a testimony in Joseph's slavery that as Potiphar's house slave, Joseph was conducting himself according to godly principles, according to Christian ethic, if you will, and it was a witness, and Potiphar saw that God was being glorified by Joseph's actions. Just a house slave. Just a house slave. So everything went well for the rest of Joseph's life, and he never had any more problems. He lived right there with Potiphar the rest of his life, and everything just was wonderful for him. He married and had kids. And that's not what happened. You know what happened? Someone told a lie about Potiphar, or about Joseph. It was Potiphar's wife. She looked upon Joseph and she saw what a handsome young man he was. And she lusted to have Joseph and desired that he would lie with her. And Joseph said, how can I do this? He said, your husband has great confidence in me. He's placed me in charge of all of his possessions. He's denied me nothing that he owns except you. And he said, how can I do this? And I want you to look at the way Joseph viewed what was being proposed here. He said, how can I sin against God? How can I sin against God? You see, if he had agreed to lie with Potiphar's wife, he would have trespassed against Potiphar, but the sin was against God. You see, that's the way it works. You know, when we get into conflicts with people and we exchange harsh words and say things that later we're sorry for, you know, oftentimes we think that we're just having a discussion with that one person and that only the two of us are being affected by that discussion. Did you know that's not so? You may say something against someone that trespasses against them, but in saying that and committing a trespass against them, you're sinning against God. Joseph understood that principle. He understood that though he might trespass against Potiphar, the sin would be against God. That he would commit a sin against his Father in heaven. He said, I can't do it. And so she told a lie. Said that he had tried to lie with her. As a result of that, Potiphar was kindled in his anger against Joseph and took him and cast him into Pharaoh's prison. You say, well, you know, this is just not fair. It's just not fair. You know, some of us have had that in our lives, haven't we? You just seem to have one tribulation piled upon another tribulation and then another. And it looks like there's never an end to it. You say, Lord, why is all this happening to me? What have I done, Lord? You know, the Savior was asked that question by his disciples concerning a man that was born blind. He said, who sinned? Was it his parents or was it the man? Who was it that sinned? Jesus said, there's no sin involved in this calamity, this tribulation, this affliction that this man has. He says, this is to the glory of God. You're going to see a great victory here. You're going to see this man more than a conqueror before the conclusion of this. When we're faced with tribulations in our lives, rather than asking the Lord, why me? Rather than sitting down on the stool of do-nothingness and pouting about it, we need to say, Lord, how can I be more than a conqueror in this tribulation? How can I take this affliction and turn it to your glory? That's what Potiphar did, or what Joseph did. He was in prison. Not only was he in prison, but if you look very carefully, he became the prisoner's servant. You know what he was? He was a slave to prisoners. Can you think of any lower rung on the social strata than that? It doesn't get any lower than that, does it? A slave to prisoners. He took those that were even under a sentence of death, in the case of Pharaoh's baker, under a sentence of death, and Joseph was that man's servant. Just as low as you can get. But Joseph said, well, Lord, if it's your will that I continue my life as a slave to prisoners, then I want to be the best slave that these prisoners ever had. Because it's to your glory, no matter what the circumstance of my life, no matter what the trial, no matter what the affliction or tribulation, it's to your glory if I serve in the capacity that you allow me to serve, if I serve you. We know how it was that shortly thereafter that the Pharaoh's baker and butler were thrown in prison. Pharaoh got mad at him about something. It doesn't say what it was, and I wouldn't even venture to guess, but he got mad at them. And they had a dream. They each had a dream. And so the next morning after their dream, Joseph noticed how sad they were because they were troubled by the dreams that they had. And he said, well, explain, tell me what your dreams are. He says, interpretation of dreams is with the Lord. He says, tell me your dreams, and perhaps the Lord will allow me to explain them to you. So they explained their dreams, and the bottom line on it was that the butler was going to be delivered back to Pharaoh, and the baker was going to be put to death, and that's exactly what happened. As the butler was gathering his things up, getting ready to go back up into the big house and serve Pharaoh again, Joseph said, remember me. When you get up to Pharaoh's house, remember me. I'm unjustly accused. I was sold into slavery. I'm a Hebrew that was sold into slavery, and I've been unjustly accused. Remember me to Pharaoh. And that's exactly what the butler did. He went up to Pharaoh and he said, you know, the most incredible thing happened to me while I was in prison. You've got this Hebrew down there in your prison, and he interpreted dreams, and he told me exactly what was going to happen, and you need a man like that on your staff, Mr. Pharaoh, so why don't you just release him from prison right now and bring him right up here? No, that's not what happened. And the butler forgot all about Joseph. Have you ever done something for someone and expecting, you know, that fundamentally it would have some effect on your friendship with that person or your relationship, and it just seems like they forgot it? Have you ever been in a time of real need, and you felt like someone ought to come to your rescue in that time of need? You felt like they understood what your need was, and they ought to come to rescue it, and they didn't. It's easy to harbor some resentment in that circumstance, isn't it? It's easy for bitterness to start creeping in. But not so with Joseph. We know the rest of the story, how after 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. And the butler said, I've committed a great sin, for I did not remember Joseph to you. He said, you've got a man down in your dungeon who can interpret these dreams. And so Pharaoh called to have Joseph delivered to him, and Joseph was delivered up to him, and he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And the interpretation was that there was going to be a famine in the land, that there would be 7 years of plenty, and then there would be a 7-year famine in the land. Now I want you to think about something. Joseph was 17 when he went into prison, or when he was sold into slavery. When he stood before Pharaoh, he was 30. 13 years. 13 years he had been a slave. 13 years he had been afflicted by the anger and the hatred of his brothers. And not only that, that 13 years was a consistent history of things just getting worse for Joseph. How many of us could remain faithful to God when for 13 years things just keep getting worse? You know, it starts off that it wasn't right in the first place what happened to us. And it seems like every day when we get up, it's a little bit worse than it was the day before. You know, I believe that would try my faith. But Joseph remained faithful. So after he had interpreted Pharaoh's dream, Pharaoh put him in charge of all of his possessions, all the possessions of Egypt. And he said, Joseph, the position of your chariot will be right behind my chariot. You know what he was saying? He said, Joseph, you're the number 2 man in Egypt. He said, I'm number 1, you're number 2. We know how the famine came, and how because of Joseph's administrative skills, which the Lord had given him, which he had honed, if you will, while a slave for Potiphar, and how Joseph, through deprivation, while in the prison there, came to understand conservation of things, and so it was that he conserved the plenty of the harvest in the 7 years of plentiful harvest, and he preserved that. Now, there was also a famine in Canaan, and his brethren came down into Egypt to buy corn. You know who they had to deal with? had to deal with Joseph. He was in charge of corn in Egypt. They had to deal with him. So when they came in there, he said, I've been waiting all these years to get even with you. I'm not going to give you any corn at all. You go back to Canaan and starve. Yeah, you deserve it. You sold me into slavery. All the misery that I've had in my life is your fault. And now it's time to pay. And you can just starve in Canaan for all I care. I'm afraid that's the reaction that I might have. It's our carnal nature to react that way, isn't it? Have you ever been faced with payback time? Has it ever come around when someone has been particularly mean to you, and all of a sudden they need you really bad? And it's payback time. You say, well, it comes around. Now it's my turn to give you a little bit of what you've been giving me. It's payback time. Do you know that's not the Lord's way? If it was, we'd all be burning in eternal hell right now. No, Joseph sold grain to his brethren. Not only did he do that, he gave their money back to them. He gave them the grain. Never stopped loving them. You see, there was no bitterness in Joseph's heart. Now think about this for a moment. These were the men that had sold him into slavery. These were the men that were responsible for him being not only a slave in Potiphar's house, but were also responsible indirectly for him being a slave in Pharaoh's dungeon. All the suffering that Joseph had experienced in all those years of captivity, he could lay right at their feet. It was their fault. And he had no bitterness. How can that be? Last night we spoke to you from the Beatitudes, the Blessed R's, the chapter of Matthew. That's how it can be. That's how it can be. See, Joseph was merciful. Because all those years of deprivation as a slave, he understood the necessity of mercy in his life. When he was Potiphar's slave, he understood that captain of the guard could snap his fingers and Joseph's head be cut off. When he was a slave there in prison, he understood that the guard of that prison, on a whim, could take his life. And so he lived by other men's mercy every day of his life. Did you know that each one of us live by the mercy of God every day of our life? Joseph understood something about mercy. And so, rather than focusing on the disappointment in his life, he focused upon the blessings of mercy that even in the circumstance of being a slave down in Egypt were so apparent that every day when he got up, it was by the mercy of God that he faced the new day. Every night when he laid his head upon his pillow and had a night's rest, it was by the mercy of God that he rested. He understood that every meal that he ate was by the mercy of God, that every kindness bestowed upon him while a prisoner was by the mercy of God. It's the same in our lives. You have nothing that you have in this life without the mercies of God. You have your husbands and your wives by the mercies of God. You have your fathers and your mothers by the mercies of God. You have your jobs and your homes and your clothing and all that you have, your personal freedoms that we have in this country by the mercies of God. Without the mercy of God, there'd be no fresh air to breathe. Without the mercy of God, there'd be no cool water to drink. Without the mercy of God, you'd never have a moment's peace in your life. And Joseph thanked God for the measure of peace that God had given him in his mercy. He understood something about mercy, and he knew that what his brethren needed more than anything was mercy. You know, when we see someone that is overtaken in the gall of bitterness in their life, it just seems like they're just looking for opportunities to lash out at people, that they're walking around with a giant chip on their shoulder all the time, just daring someone to knock it off. You know what those people need most? They need mercy. They need mercy. They need for us to look at them and say, look at that poor brother and sister that's opposing himself. Oh, I pray that the Lord will be merciful to them, to allow them to see the blessings of God, to look beyond the circumstance that is immediately around them, to stop focusing on all of the things that have happened in their life that don't fit that glorious definition that they had of how things were going to go for them when they were a young person. To look beyond that and see how they can be a conqueror and even more than a conqueror in the circumstances that they have in their life. Joseph gave his brethren grain. Later, he revealed himself to his brethren, and he told them, he said, don't be angry with yourselves. He said, don't be mad because you sold me into slavery, because the Lord has used it for good. You see, it was by Joseph's hand that many people were delivered, that many people were saved alive by Joseph's hand. The Lord took the misery of the circumstance of Joseph's life and made it a victory. When Fanny Crosby, who was a lady who was blind, wrote the wonderful song, Blessed Assurance, one of the lines in that song is visions of rapture now burst on my sight. Do you see that in her blindness she had a victory that went beyond seeing the features of her mother's face or her sibling's face. She was able to look in that victory and see Jesus' face. We can look at the circumstance in our life, at the affliction of arthritis, at the affliction of old age, at the affliction of loneliness after we lose a mate to death, at the affliction of disappointment of career goals, at the affliction of broken relationships. We can go to the Lord with that affliction, and He'll make us conquerors, nay, more than conquerors. He gives us the victory, and He gives us something more. You know, some years later, after Joseph's brethren and his father had moved down to Egypt, Jacob died. And after he was buried, and after the period of mourning had concluded, Joseph's brethren got together and they said, Joseph is going to hate us now. The only reason he was being nice to us is because of Dad. And Dad's gone now. And now we're really going to see it. We're really going to get it now. He's going to come after us now. We're in deep trouble. So let's make up a story. Say that Dad told us that Joseph was supposed to be good to us after he died. And for the sake of Dad's memory, Joseph will continue to be good to us. So they concocted this story, and they went to Joseph with it, and they told Joseph. And Joseph began to weep. You know what he was weeping about? He was sorrowing for the bitterness of his brothers. You see, the Lord had given him the victory way back over there when he was Potiphar's slave. The Lord had given him the victory. And his brethren had been struggling under a yoke of bondage of guilt all of those years. You know why? Because they never asked the Lord to forgive them. They'd never repented of what they had done. So many of the Lord's people are carrying baggage of guilt with them today. And all you have to do is take it to the Lord and leave it there. Just say, Lord, I don't have to go into the details of that sin. You were right there when it happened. You know what I did. You know that I sinned against you and you alone. And I can't offer any justification for my actions. All I can do is remind you that you're a merciful God and beg that you'll have mercy on me, a sinner. The Lord will remove that burden of sin. He'll take bitterness right out of your heart. It will amaze you how much lighter your life will seem after the Lord takes that bitterness from you over something you've done. Maybe you're so ashamed of it that you don't even want to admit to the Lord that you did it. But He was there. He knows. Take it to Him. Ask His forgiveness. Because in so doing, then you can gain the victory that Joseph had. Do you know how we're more than conquerors? Joseph not only overcame the affliction of being sold into slavery, he was a conqueror in that. By God's grace, he overcame that. He lived above it. The Apostle Paul had an affliction in the flesh. It never says what it was. I think it was vision, but it never says specifically what it was. You can think what you want as to what it was. If you have arthritis, think that it's arthritis. If you have a bad heart, think that it's a bad heart. If you have an arrogant spirit, think that it's an arrogant spirit. Whatever you want to think. It was never named. I think the reason it was never named is so that we can identify with it. He prayed to the Lord 3 times that affliction in the flesh would be removed. You know what the Lord said? He said, my grace is sufficient unto thee. He said, Paul, by my grace you can live with this affliction. By my grace you can live with this affliction. You know what living with affliction is? By the grace of God, what living with affliction is? It's the victory. It's the victory in your life. It makes you a conqueror. You know how you become more than a conqueror? By taking that affliction. By taking that affliction and making it to the glory of God. You're more than a conqueror. You see, if the Lord doesn't remove the affliction from you, and yet you live a life that glorifies God, there's no bitterness in you, you can continue to serve Him to the best of your abilities as God has given you ability. You continue to serve Him. And you become a powerful witness. You know, the Lord could have removed Paul's thorn in the flesh. And then all Paul could have said about his thorn in the flesh is, I once had a thorn in the flesh and the Lord removed it. There's a victory there. But by bearing that thorn in the flesh where people could see it, where people could see that Paul was serving the Lord despite his affliction and because of his affliction, because he needed God's grace in his life. People could see that Paul not only had a victory in his life over that affliction, but there was more than a victory here. There was glory to God going up. In this, we're more than conquerors. Joseph was more than a conqueror. If you're suffering from an affliction this morning, if you have arthritis, be the best arthritic disciple that Christ has. You laugh about that. I was told here not too long ago about a communion service that a brother was in, and a minister friend of mine was in. He said there was an elderly man there and he had arthritis in his knees. And he couldn't kneel. He couldn't bend his knees to kneel to wash his brother's feet. He said when it was time, after he had had his feet washed, and it was time to wash his brother's feet, he says he slid off the bench and laid on his side and washed his brother's feet. He was the best arthritic Christian that was in that communion service that day. Do you see that? You see how the Lord can take a diseased heart and make it a powerful witness? Do you see how he can take the loneliness of the loss of a loved one in death and make it a powerful witness? He can take the disappointments of career failures and make it a powerful witness. He can take whatever the circumstance in your life and make it a testimony to his power and glory. And what an effect it has on those that you come in contact with. In these things, we are more than conquerors. God bless you.
Before the throne of God above, I have a strong, a perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me.
Visit the Primitive Baptist Digital Library for videos, articles, history, hymns, and encouragement. www.primitivebaptist.net